Today we're going to review the unit circle. We'll talk about it in terms of degrees, radians, even coordinates, ordered pairs. So let's start by talking about the unit circle in terms of degrees. Now, as you've studied before, we know that there are certain patterns when it comes to studying the unit circle in all of these ways. So if we really focus on the first quadrant, it should really help us with the rest of the unit circle. So here's my first quadrant. As you can see here, we know that the x-axis, this would be 0 degrees. This right here would be 90 degrees. Now, let's take from 0 to 90 and split it up into three equal sections. So 1, 2. So notice that I have 1, 2, 3 congruent angles here, right? So I divided that 90-degree angle into 3 congruent angles. So that would mean each of these angles is how many degrees each? 30, right? So now from the x-axis to this first angle, that would be a 30-degree angle. From the x-axis to this next one, now this was 30 and this was 30, so this would be 60 degrees. And then, of course, that last one was 30 also, so this would be 90 degrees. So let's do something similar. Now, instead of dividing this 90-degree angle into 3 equal sections, now let's divide it into 2. So I'm just going to cut it in half, which means that each of these, so the x-axis to this purple line I just drew, from the purple line to this y-axis, each of these are 45 degrees. So I'm going to write that here. Okay? Now, this pattern is going to follow as we move around the unit circle. So let me draw in the rest of this. Oh man, that's going to drive me nuts. Okay. There we go. Now I have my second quadrant here. So just like we did in the green color here, we're going to, maybe I should draw that this is 180 degrees, right? A line would be 180 degrees. Same thing here. Now let's split this up into 3 congruent angles. So I'm going to split this up. Okay. So a couple of ways to think about this. Just like before, we knew that each of these angles would be 30 degrees. So I could take 90 and add 30 degrees to it, or I could think of it in terms of the reference angle, right? So reference angle is a good vocabulary term for us to be familiar with. That would be that smallest angle between the terminal side, so the x-axis here, and the terminal side. So for example, this, maybe I should draw this in. From the x-axis to the terminal side, I know that that's 30 degrees, right? So that would be 180 minus 30, which is 150 degrees. I could do the same thing here, right? I know from here to here, that's 60 degrees. Let's draw it in just for fun. So this angle here would be 180 minus 60, which is 120 degrees. Awesome. We have another one, though. Remember, we want to split this up into 2 congruent angles, so I'm going to do that in purple. Okay, so very similar. From here to here is 45 degrees, so 180 minus 45 would be 135 degrees. Okay, so try filling in the rest of the circle in a similar way using reference angles. And then we'll move on to radians. So go ahead, finish the rest of the circle, and then let's move on. Okay, let's talk about the unit circle in terms of radians. Okay, so radians is another way to measure angles. Let's also, once again, focus on that first quadrant, and then we'll move our way around. Okay. So one thing I just want us to keep in mind is that when we are talking about the unit circle, our radius is 1, right? Our unit is 1 unit. So when we talk about radians here, we have to remember that the circle, the circumference is 2 pi r, which in this case r is going to be 1. So we have 2 pi, right? going all the way around the circle. So this would start at 0 pi. And then as we come all the way back around, we should end up back at 2 pi. Which means if I think about this, right, so if this is 0 pi, this would be 1 pi, so this should be 1/2 pi, or pi over 2. Okay. Awesome. So let's do the same thing that we did before. So remember, we started by dividing this first quadrant into 3 congruent angles. 1, 2, so 1, 2, 3, 3 congruent ones. Now we want to determine, in radians, what each of these are. So if you think about it, we have, let me use the blue color. I have pi over 2 from 0 to pi over 2, and I want to divide that into 3 congruent sections, right? 1, 2, 3. So that would be pi over 6. So each section is going to be pi over 6. So we'll start here. Actually, I should probably make that in green. Sorry, I can be crazy about colors sometimes. Pi over 6. Okay, but this distance from this angle to this one is pi over 6, but we know that that's going to be 2 pi over 6, which is pi over 3. This would have been 3 pi over 6, which is pi over 2, so that makes sense. Okay. Very similarly, now if I divide the section into 2 congruent pieces, right? So now it's in half. Think about it another time. This is kind of my scratch work over here, so just think of it that way. So now I have pi over 2, but I want to divide it into 2 congruent sections. So now that's going to be, each one is going to be pi over 4. So this is pi over 4. This would have been 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. Okay. Now, again, we could do the same thing in our second quadrant here. Remember that we said that this will be pi, right? So 0 pi to 1 pi, 2 pi over here. Okay. Again, let's split this up into 3 sections. Okay. So this was pi over 6. This was 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6. This would be 4 pi over 6, which does reduce to 2 pi over 3. This would be, instead of 4 pi over 6, 5 pi over 6, and then 6 pi over 6, which is just pi. Okay, again with the purple, let's cut this in half now. So we had 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4. This would be 3 pi over 4, and 4 pi over 4 to complete it. Okay? So what I'd like you to do, again, just like we did in degrees, is I'd like you to fill in the rest of the unit circle. Okay? Thinking of the same way that we use, pi over 6 and pi over 4 is our distance. Okay? Go ahead. Okay, so now let's talk about it in terms of coordinates. Okay. So when we are thinking about the ordered pairs, again, it is helpful to understand, starting with our first quadrant. Also, as I was saying before, and it's just really important for us to remember, I want to remember for the unit circle that our radius is always 1. So this ordered pair here, so our x-axis, we're going out 1, 0. Here would be 0, 1. Okay? So let's talk about that first scenario when we had that 30-degree angle here. And I'm going to draw a right triangle. Remember, we said that this was 30 degrees, so I'm going to put the 30 degrees here, which right away we should identify that this is a 30, 60, 90 triangle. Let's get this highlighter and highlight that this is the angle that we're dealing with right now. Okay, so because we know it's a 30, 60, 90 degree triangle, hopefully you remember that this would be x, This would be x root 3, and this would be 2x. Okay. So let's think about what we know. Well, we should know this distance right here, right? Remember, this is representing the radius of the unit circle. So we do know that 2x would equal 1, right? Because the radius is 1. So x equals 1/2. Knowing this, we should be able to determine the ordered pair for this spot here. So we know already that our y value, because this is going to be our y value, the vertical distance, our y value is going to be 1/2. And to figure out what our x value is for this, we're going to have to plug in our 1/2 for x. So we have 1/2 root 3, which is root 3 over 2. Okay, so that's just one of our ordered pairs. We can do that with several more. We'll do that with 2 more cases, and you guys should be able to figure out the rest. So let's do the scenario where we have that 45-degree angle, so where we cut it in half, which means it's a 45, 45, 90 triangle, right? Okay, so once again, we think back to what we already know about 45, 45, 90 triangles. This is x, x, x root 2. Now, one of these sides, we already know its length, which would be this hypotenuse here, because this is the radius. We know that for the unit circle, the radius is always 1. So again, this is my kind of my scratch work area over here. We know that x root 2 should equal 1. So if I solve for x, I get x equals 1 over root 2. Rationalize that denominator, I get root 2 over 2. Sweet. So that ordered pair here, if x is root 2 over 2, my x-coordinate is going to be root 2 over 2. My y-coordinate is root 2 over 2. This is fun. Okay, last scenario here that we're going to cover, and then I'll ask you guys to finish the rest. So let's do it when the angle is 60 degrees. Back to a 30, 60, 90 here. Again, I'm just highlighting this angle down here just so we're focused on like what is our degree measure on the unit circle that we're focusing on here. Okay, so again, thinking about what we know, this would be x root 3, this would be x, and this would be 2x. So once again, think about what we know. We know that the side with the 2x, or the hypotenuse of the triangle, scratch work, is going to equal 1, so x equals 1/2. So let's use this information to help us determine our x and y value of this ordered pair. Well, the x value is easy. X is 1/2, comma. If I plug this in here, I would get root 3 over 2. Now, when you're filling in the rest of the unit circle, it gets pretty easy, especially with these ordered pairs, because we do have that symmetry with the x-axis or even the y-axis, depending. So I'll just kind of model that on this example here. Right, this would be my 60-degree angle, 30. If I think about what my ordered pair has to be over here, I mean, symmetry, right? So this time I know that since I'm moving in the negative direction on the x-axis, of course this is going to be negative 1/2, but we still have that same y value, root 3 over 2. Okay, so go ahead and finish your unit circle using the ordered pairs.